Civitas' show this year was deceptively difficult. It was absurdly musical with constantly changing dynamics. This is very difficult to clean. It's so much easier to be able to clean up something where everything that's loud is here and everything that's soft is here, compared to where you've got dynamics constantly changing in between them. For example, if you are playing a roll, how do you clean a roll? So are you going to make it so that it's a step motion with the dynamics? So you're going from like 3, 3, 6, 6, 9, 9, 12, 12? Or are you going to make it so it's like 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, 11, 12, 14, etc.? Like, are each one of the notes going to crescendo? Or is it going to be stepwise where you have 2, 2, 2, 2? Or are you going to have a dynamic so that it is linear, so that it's going, let's say, for 2 or 4 counts? An even distribution of changes in dynamics, either louder or softer? Or is it going to be more exponential, where you stay lower for longer and then at the very end, all of a sudden you get much louder or much softer? So these are all things that you would have to clean if you're working on dynamics, as opposed to playing something at a 2-height system where everything is either high or low. So it is much, much, much more difficult to clean up crescendos, decrescendos, linear, curvilinear approaches to dynamic changes, etc. Kudos to everyone who is performing in Civitas, but also like the instructors and whatnot who are working with that. It was a difficult choice, but they executed it very well. So GG's to everybody who is a part of that organization. Before I get to the next tip, I just want to say really quickly that you can find literally thousands of hours of free drumming play-alongs and drumming tips in the link at the top of the description, or by going into my home tab of YouTube. Rubato is where you temporarily and intentionally speed up or slow down a little bit for some expressive effect. So for example, a phrase might start and end at the same tempo, but you might speed up or slow down slightly within that macro phase. For example, if it's like a 4-bar phrase or something, you might be at 120, the starting and ending, but you might go down to like 115 and then maybe up to like 130 or something, kind of in between there, just for a little bit of time to make it so that you are kind of fluctuating with the time intentionally. And you can also do the same thing with dynamics as well. So if you think of like dynamic levels as skyscrapers, we have like different levels like pianissimo, piano, mezzo forte, forte, fortissimo, etc. Within the skyscraper, each level has a floor and a ceiling within that particular dynamic range. So the floor being one dynamic level lower, and then the ceiling being one dynamic level higher. So you're able to kind of float in between them. So let's say you're playing something at 6 inches. If you're playing at 6, you can go down to the lower dynamic level of 3. You can also go up to the higher dynamic level of like 9 inches, and everything in between, while kind of like maintaining the center at 6. So that is the level that you're playing on. So one of the things that you can think about when you're practicing is it as like storytelling. Music that you're making is no longer with words, but is with the music that you are performing. So you could emphasize some parts of the musical phrase more than others. And you can do that with some dynamic changes. You can also do that with some tempo changes. And those are just 2 of the many different ways that you can make music with this. Now, this is much easier to do, the rubato with tempo and rubato with dynamics, when you are playing as a solo instrument, like on a solo snare drum. But if you're on a snare line with like 7 other people who are all performing, that is much harder to do dynamic changes, rubato, so like tempo changes, etc. Which is why most of the snare lines and drum lines that you will see, they will play at 2 heights, they will play at consistent dynamics or a consistent speed that is not going to fluctuate in any way. However, that doesn't mean that's the only way that you can or should play, especially if you're playing some concert repertoire. Highly encourage you to experiment with changes in the speed and the dynamics at the micro and macro phrasing level. So think of the full phrase of whatever it is you're working on and trying to make it as musical as possible by changing some different aspects of it. I had a marimba student studying with me privately, and she's like, I really like the way this is written, but I want to change it so that there's more rubato here and flip the dynamics this way. And I was like, musically, that sounds great. So if you perform it this way, you need to have a very sound musical response to why you chose to do it different than it was intended. And if you're able to defend that, then I can't argue to say you have to play it one specific way. Often music is like presented as black and white, like you have to do it one way, but you can fluctuate from the intent of the composer if there's a musical reason for doing that. If you want to change the story, the narrative, essentially, in my opinion, it's okay to do that. But I will say that there are some composers who do get offended by that, but I think it's important to understand that there are many ways to express oneself. If we think of music as like storytelling through sound, I am a better performer because of the fact that I played all these different instruments, I can find similarities with the techniques that can transfer over from one instrument to another. So for example, yesterday when I was playing drum kit, I talked about a Julie Spencer technique where instead of moving your arm like a tenor player, where you'd keep it so that you're playing the same angle of the drum, for mallets, you can actually rotate and do a flick where you are playing like this. And if you do that on drum kit, it makes it so that your arm's not having to move as much when you're doing a very fast back and forth between the hi-hat and the ride. And so that's a valid technique that you can use that I wouldn't have known about if I didn't practice mallets. So there's a lot of like really beneficial things that you can learn with it. Here's another example of this. So with 4 mallets, Lee Howard Stevens talks about how when you're doing chord changes and whatnot, that you should strike so that when you move, you immediately go to the next position and you hover over it so you can get a perfectly vertical downstroke while working on this. So that can also apply over into tenor drums. So if you're doing like a crossover, you don't want to go at a glancing angle when working on your tenors, when doing like a crossover. You want to ideally be able to move so that you're moving straight down into the crossover. So to do that, when you hit, you want to move as quickly as possible so you can get a downward strike as opposed to a glancing strike, which is going to give you a weaker sound quality and potentially even like hit the rim and move over into other stuff. So learning multiple different instruments makes you better at whatever your primary instrument is. In my case, my primary instrument is snare drum, but I became a better snare drummer by working on marimba, vibraphone, timpani, all sorts of other things that have informed the way I approach the snare drum, which is my primary instrument. I've had some students who wanted to like go and teach, and the way that I'd phrase it to them is, okay, are you only going to teach snare drum? Or do you think you're ever going to get in front of the tenor line or the front ensemble? Or do you not want to ever become the caption head? Do you only want to be the snare tech the entire time? Like, prepare yourself for that really long-term success. Like, I was able to jump into a caption head role immediately because I knew all of the instruments. So I didn't just stand in front of the snare line the entire time, even though that was like my passion and the thing that I was interested in. So that might be one way to like sell it to them, is if you want to like teach, you want to be able to like potentially make more income by like being the caption head or working with other students privately, as opposed to just snare drum students. But another way is just like framing it as like you become a better snare drummer by learning other instruments. One of the cool things that I like about teaching, and like having done it for over 20 years now, is like what works for some students explaining things doesn't work for others. You have to find like several different ways to teach something, which is neat because then it like forces you to think of a concept in like several different ways. So you end up better understanding the content you're teaching just because you're having to think of several ways of explaining that one single concept. Helps you to approach it from many different angles and whatnot. So I personally like that part of teaching, which is why I like teaching made me a better player, as weird as that might sound. Let's say you're working on your flam taps. My stick flew in the air and like landed on the button that says start and tune. That's hilarious.